For the German troops preparing to launch Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union was largely an enigma. Since the Bolshevik Revolution, reliable information about the country had been scarce. What little reached Germany was filtered through propaganda, either hostile or sympathetic. The dominant perception was simple. The USSR was a dictatorship ruled by rigid authority and strict control. It was widely assumed that the standard of living was far lower than in Western Europe. To the average German soldier in 1941, Russia appeared as a vast, closed, impoverished land under a ruthless regime. The communist political and economic system was viewed as oppressive, more restrictive even than their own. Added to this was a racial ideology deeply embedded in Nazi thinking. Many Germans had been taught to believe that Slavic peoples were inherently inferior. If that were true, it seemed logical, within that warped framework, that their homeland must be primitive and backward. German propaganda reinforced this belief. After conquering Poland in 1939, images of its rural poverty were circulated to confirm the doctrine of racial superiority. The implication was clear. Backward conditions were presented not as the result of political turmoil or war, but as proof of racial inferiority. And yet, despite all the ideological certainty, most Germans knew surprisingly little about the Soviet Union. They understood one fact clearly: its immense size. Geographically, it covered roughly 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. But few could truly grasp what that meant until they entered it. When German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory in June 1941, they were overwhelmed not only by resistance, but by space itself. Endless sunflower fields stretched beyond sight, solid bands of yellow reaching distant horizons. Cornfields extended for miles. Vast forests rose with dense undergrowth, so thick they felt like jungles. Some were nearly impenetrable. Advancing even a few hundred meters required immense effort. Swamps posed another challenge, particularly in central and northwestern Belarus. They spanned areas comparable in size to entire German provinces. Rivers flowed without the dikes common in Western Europe, prone to flooding across flat terrain. Water spread across lowlands for months, expanding already massive marshes. This was the battlefield. Climate added another layer of shock. Germany experienced cold winters and warm summers, but nothing like the extremes of the Soviet Union. Temperatures plunged to 30 or 40 degrees below zero in winter. In summer, heat soared to unbearable levels. In the years after the war, some questioned whether German suffering during the first winter could have been mitigated had Soviet infrastructure, roads and railways, been more developed. If the German High Command had been able to rotate exhausted troops or resupply effectively, the army might have endured more easily. But such mobility never materialized. Few Western Europeans truly understood the daily realities of life on the Eastern Front. While the Red Army fought fiercely and often fanatically, German troops initially encountered something unexpected. In certain regions, they were greeted warmly. In territories annexed by the Soviet Union in 1939, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, many locals viewed Soviet rule as harsh and repressive. When German infantry and armored columns entered, some residents welcomed them as liberators. Flowers were thrown onto passing vehicles. Buckets of milk and water were placed beside roads for marching troops. Villagers held up Bibles and religious icons, blessing the soldiers who, in their eyes, were crusaders against atheistic communism. In parts of Ukraine, Georgia, and the Caucasus, volunteers even emerged eager to join the fight against Moscow's central authority. To German soldiers, this reception was difficult to reconcile. Civilians cheered them, yet Red Army units fought to the last man. Behind German lines, partisan resistance soon emerged, often supported by the same populations that had once offered bread and salt. The illusion of liberation dissolved quickly. Repression followed resistance. Violence escalated. Initial optimism gave way to a brutal war defined by retaliation and fear. What had begun with applause turned into a cycle of terror and counter-terror. The belief that the majority of Soviet peoples longed for freedom from communism proved far more complicated than imagined. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, under a clear summer sky, the Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border. There was no formal declaration of war. The invasion was launched as a sudden, overwhelming strike. Surprise was essential. German planners believed that speed and shock would secure a rapid victory. Stalin had received repeated warnings that Germany was preparing an attack. Yet he refused to place the Red Army on full defensive alert. Soviet doctrine dictated that in the event of aggression, forces should carry the war into enemy territory rather than wait passively. Consequently, many Soviet units were concentrated near the frontier. This concentration proved disastrous. German panzer groups smashed through forward defenses, forming massive encirclements, what they called cauldrons, and advanced hundreds of kilometers within days. In the first week alone, German armored spearheads pushed nearly 400 kilometers into Soviet territory. Infantry divisions followed behind the fast-moving tanks under a burning summer sun. Their role was relentless: march, secure captured ground, eliminate trapped Soviet units, and march again. Dust-coated faces and uniforms, Soviet prisoners numbered in the hundreds of thousands. German leadership felt vindicated. Before the invasion, many had feared that the Red Army would retreat deep into the interior, refusing decisive battle as in 1812 against Napoleon. Instead, Soviet forces fought fiercely along the frontier, suffering enormous losses but contesting ground. By June 28th, Minsk had fallen. By mid-July, German troops approached Smolensk. In just 3 weeks, the distance to Moscow had shrunk dramatically. Confidence soared. Even the German chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, believed in early July that the campaign might be concluded within weeks. Similar assumptions were shared in Britain and the United States, where observers predicted Soviet collapse. But such optimism contradicted military logic. Traditionally, attackers required a 3-to-1 numerical advantage to ensure decisive victory. On the Eastern Front, defenders often retained numerical superiority. Despite encirclements and staggering losses, Soviet resistance remained determined and increasingly organized. German successes came at heavy cost. Breakthrough battles inflicted severe casualties. Equipment deteriorated rapidly under strain. Soon more vehicles were lost to dust, mud, and atrocious roads than to enemy fire. By August 1941, some German officers began to sense the deeper reality of the East. Supplies grew thin, fuel, ammunition, spare parts. Everything became scarce. Logistics could not keep pace with the rapid advance across immense distances. The idea of blitzkrieg, lightning war, began to lose its shine. On August 11th, Halder admitted privately that Germany had underestimated the Soviet colossus. the initial plan had not fully resolved a central question. Where should the decisive blow fall? Hitler favored securing industrial and resource-rich regions in the north and south, particularly Ukraine and the Baltic areas. His military advisors, however, argued that only a concentrated strike toward Moscow could deliver decisive victory. Moscow represented more than a city. It was the political, administrative, and symbolic heart of the Soviet Union. Its capture, many believed, would shatter enemy morale. Yet the war unfolding across the vast plains suggested that no single blow might suffice. In August, Hitler redirected major forces southward. The result appeared spectacular. Near Kiev, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were encircled and captured. The Kiev pocket became one of the largest military defeats in history. But despite this triumph, the strategic situation remained unresolved. By early October 1941, Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, was launched. Nearly 2 million men were assembled for what many hoped would be the final offensive. Initial gains were impressive. Soviet forces suffered catastrophic losses in the twin battles of Vyazma and Bryansk. By December, some German units stood within 30 kilometers of Moscow. The Kremlin seemed almost visible, yet exhaustion was evident everywhere. Autumn rains transformed roads into seas of mud. Entire formations stalled. Vehicles sank axle deep. Artillery pieces could not be moved. Horses collapsed from strain. Then winter arrived. The German High Command had prepared winter equipment only for a limited occupation force, assuming the campaign would conclude before severe cold set in. Most soldiers still wore worn summer uniforms. Temperatures plunged below minus 30 degrees. Daily life became a struggle for survival. Men rose before dawn to march in darkness. Washing was impossible. Water froze instantly. Days ended late at night, after caring for horses and equipment, before collapsing in inadequate shelters. Still, commanders pressed forward, believing Soviet collapse was imminent. But from winter 1941 to 42 onward, the German Eastern Army lived in a state of constant improvisation. Supplies were rationed. Units fought day by day. Catastrophe was postponed but not avoided. What sustained many divisions was cohesion and professional leadership. Even amid horrendous losses, desertion remained rare. Authority and discipline, reinforced by ideological conviction, held the army together. Many soldiers believed they were defending Europe from Bolshevism. Propaganda portrayed the invasion as preventive, a necessary strike to forestall Soviet aggression. For younger soldiers especially, raised under Nazi indoctrination, this narrative carried weight. Yet perceptions shifted as reality contradicted promises. The war in the East was not a short campaign of liberation. It was becoming something far larger and far more destructive than anyone had imagined. As the war dragged on, German soldiers gradually realized that the promises made before the invasion did not match the reality unfolding before them. What had been presented as a preventive strike against a threatening power became an exhausting war of attrition against a state whose resources, human and material, seemed inexhaustible. By 1942, German losses had already exceeded 1 million dead, wounded, or missing. A full-scale offensive along the entire front was no longer feasible. Instead, German leadership concentrated forces for a new summer campaign in the south. Time was becoming critical. In December 1941, Germany had declared war on the United States. If there was any remaining chance for the Reich, Hitler believed it lay in securing the oil fields of the Caucasus before American industrial power could fully mobilize. The new plan unfolded in two phases: advance toward the Volga at Stalingrad, then pivot south to seize the Caucasus oil reserves. Without oil, Germany calculated, the Soviet Union would collapse. Operation Blue began on June 28, 1942. After preliminary battles around Kharkov and on the Crimean Peninsula, German forces, supported by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian allies, pushed forward again. At first, progress seemed rapid. Columns moved eastward across the steppe in vast clouds of dust. By late July, German troops crossed into territories geographically considered part of Asia. In August, mountain troops planted the war flag atop Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in the Caucasus. Reconnaissance units of the Sixth Army reached the banks of the Volga, north of Stalingrad. Never before had German control extended so far. Yet beneath these dramatic images, the offensive machine was straining. Supplies were inadequate, units were overextended, divisions were reduced to skeletal strength. Some officers admitted in reports that their men were fighting in little more than shirts. The Red Army had finally adapted. After initial hesitation, Stalin allowed tactical withdrawals, avoiding encirclement when possible. German commanders noted with concern that fewer Soviet prisoners were being captured. Instead of collapsing, Soviet resistance hardened. Despite warnings from the front, Hitler divided his forces, sending them simultaneously toward Stalingrad and deep into the Caucasus. The gamble stretched German resources dangerously thin. At first, the advance did not appear to falter. German units moved through the steppe, through dust storms and scorching heat, capturing ruined oil facilities and pressing toward strategic objectives. But momentum was deceptive. In the Caucasus forests and the ruins of Stalingrad, fighting intensified. Stalingrad, in particular, transformed into a brutal urban battlefield. It became more than a military objective. It became a contest of prestige between two dictators. On July 28th, Stalin issued Order Number 227, not one step back. Hitler responded in speeches claiming that victory was already assured. But words could not substitute for reality. On November 19th and 20th, 1942, Soviet forces launched massive counteroffensives north and south of Stalingrad. The sectors held primarily by Romania and other Allied units collapsed under the assault of Soviet armored formations. Within days, the German Sixth Army was encircled. Approximately 200,000 men were trapped in freezing ruins, surrounded by multiple Soviet armies. Attempts to supply them by air were insufficient. Only about 25,000 were evacuated. Over 100,000 eventually fell into Soviet captivity. Few would ever return. On February 2, 1943, the last organized resistance ended. A final radio transmission reported freezing temperatures and grim conditions before falling silent. Stalingrad acquired immense symbolic weight. Though not the sole turning point of the war, it marked a profound psychological rupture. Germany's aura of invincibility shattered. Allied hope increased. Axis allies reconsidered their commitment. Yet even after Stalingrad, the Eastern Front did not collapse immediately. In the north and center, grinding battles of attrition continued. The conflict had evolved into something far different from the rapid conquest envisioned in 1941. The Eastern Front was no longer a campaign of movement. It had become a prolonged struggle defined by exhaustion adaptation, and increasingly total commitment from both sides. Life on the Eastern Front defied simple explanation. For the individual soldier, German or Soviet, the war often narrowed to immediate survival and the small circle of his unit. Grand strategies formulated in distant headquarters meant little to men crouched in trenches or advancing across frozen fields. Letters, diaries, and memoirs from both sides repeat similar themes: exhaustion, camaraderie, moments of exhilaration after surviving battle, the crushing weight of loss, fear, constant, intimate, unavoidable. There were long stretches of monotony, endless marches, digging defensive positions, standing watch in isolated outposts, scavenging for food, waiting for orders. These periods were punctuated by sudden episodes of intensity when fate could change in seconds. It is important to understand that daily life did not consist of non-stop combat or constant atrocities. Much of the soldier's time was consumed by logistics, maintenance, and endurance. Actual battlefield engagements were violent and chaotic, but they were also shaped by military objectives. Violence during combat possessed a certain symmetry, two armed forces confronting each other. War crimes, however, were far more common in areas removed from active battle. In rear zones, where the front had moved on, individual responsibility became more pronounced. The Eastern Front radicalized quickly. Repression provoked resistance. Terror generated counter-terror. Fanaticism fed fanaticism. As partisan activity intensified behind German lines, harsh reprisals followed. Many officers faced situations for which there were no clear directives. Some resorted to executions and severe measures as the simplest solution. The illusion of being welcomed as liberators evaporated. Those same civilians who had once offered bread and salt sometimes later supported partisan units or attacked isolated German soldiers. When German forces began retreating westward, they encountered populations willing to retaliate brutally. The cycle of violence deepened. From 1943 onward, the war in the East hardened into a struggle defined by attrition and ideology. For many German soldiers, awareness grew that the campaign was no longer defensive or preventive, but entangled in something morally darker. The sense of collective or national guilt, though rarely articulated openly, lingered in private reflections. At the same time, fear of Soviet retribution became a powerful motivator. As the front approached German borders, many soldiers believed they were now defending their homeland from Bolshevism. This conviction contributed to the Army's continued resistance, even in dire circumstances. It would be simplistic, however, to attribute soldiers' actions solely to ideology or personal will. Most were constrained by rigid military structures and the dictatorship under which they served. Orders flowed downward. Disobedience carried severe consequences. Opportunities to influence policy or strategy were minimal for ordinary troops. Many held subordinate roles with limited agency. War created a system in which individuals operated within a vast machine of command and submission. Desertion or surrender posed grave dangers on both sides. Prisoners often faced brutal conditions. For German soldiers captured by the Red Army, and for Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans, detention could resemble the harshest forms of incarceration. The Eastern Front became a confrontation not only between armies, but between two totalitarian systems. Both sides developed enormous capacity for suffering. Both endured extreme pressure from political leadership. In the German army, early operational success had relied partly on granting initiative to lower-level commanders. But as setbacks mounted, Hitler increasingly centralized control, interfering directly in operational decisions. In contrast, the Red Army gradually gained greater flexibility over time, though often at tremendous cost. The brutality of Soviet command structures was undeniable. The Red Army executed or imprisoned many of its own soldiers for perceived cowardice or retreat. Human life was frequently expended in massive offensives. Yet as the tide turned in favor of the Soviet Union, material and strategic conditions improved. German soldiers, meanwhile, faced relentless deterioration: fewer supplies, fewer replacements, increasing isolation. The Eastern Front's scale compounded every challenge. The Soviet Union encompassed vast climatic zones, temperate regions, subarctic expanses, even subtropical areas. Summers could bring suffocating heat and dust. Autumn rains transformed roads into impassable mud. Winters brought merciless cold. Population density varied dramatically. Germany had over 130 inhabitants per square kilometer. In parts of Russia, the figure dropped to fewer than 10. The land felt empty, endless. And yet, the total Soviet population, approaching 200 million by 1941, ensured an enormous reservoir of manpower. German strategists had once hoped to exploit ethnic divisions within the Soviet Union. With more than 60 nationalities and numerous minority groups, internal fragmentation appeared possible. But ideological rigidity and racial policies prevented any coherent strategy of partnership. Hitler refused to adjust. Instead of learning from experience, he escalated. The war in the East was no longer a rapid conquest. It was becoming a grinding conflict in which exhaustion, climate, and industrial capacity would decide outcomes. The summer offensive of 1942, Operation Blue, was conceived as a decisive move. After the failures and brutal winter of 1941–42, Germany no longer possessed the strength to attack along the entire front. Instead, the High Command concentrated its remaining reserves in the south. The objective was clear: seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut the Volga supply artery at Stalingrad. Oil was the lifeblood of mechanized war. Without it, Germany believed, the Soviet Union would collapse. And if Soviet resistance collapsed before American war production reached full capacity, the strategic balance might shift back in Germany's favor. The offensive began with speed. German and Allied formations surged eastward. Dust clouds rose across the steppe. The Red Army, having learned from earlier disasters, withdrew in many sectors to avoid encirclement. This withdrawal created the illusion of a vacuum. German columns advanced into vast, seemingly empty spaces. Yet this emptiness concealed strain. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Rail networks were inadequate. Fuel had to be transported across immense distances. The farther the advance, the more fragile logistics became. Some officers began to worry openly that the Wehrmacht was striking at air. Nevertheless, Hitler divided his forces. Rather than concentrating entirely on Stalingrad or entirely on the Caucasus, he ordered parallel thrusts, splitting strength at a moment when concentration was essential. At first, the gamble appeared successful. Mountain troops planted flags in the Caucasus peaks. German reconnaissance units reached the Volga's banks. Maps colored in Berlin showed enormous territorial gains. But beneath the surface, exhaustion was spreading. Fighting in the Caucasus forests proved slow and attritional. The terrain favored defenders. Meanwhile, in Stalingrad, the battle transformed into urban devastation. Factories, apartment blocks, and rubble became fortresses. Fighting occurred room by room, floor by floor. The conflict ceased to resemble maneuver warfare. It became annihilation. For the German Sixth Army, Stalingrad was intended as a symbol of victory. Instead, it became a trap. When Soviet forces counterattacked in November 1942, they targeted weaker sectors held by Romania and other Allied armies. These formations lacked adequate equipment and leadership to withstand the Soviet armored thrusts. Within days, the encirclement was complete. Over 200,000 German soldiers were trapped. Winter descended again. Attempts to supply the pocket by air failed to meet requirements. Promises of relief proved hollow. Orders from Hitler forbade breakout attempts. The Sixth Army withered. Starvation, frostbite, and Soviet artillery ground down resistance. Only a fraction of those captured would survive captivity. Stalingrad marked more than a military defeat. It marked a psychological fracture. Germany's allies began questioning their participation. Neutral observers recalculated probabilities. Within Germany itself, unease spread. Yet despite catastrophe, the Eastern Front did not collapse instantly. In 1943, heavy fighting continued. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of that year demonstrated the shift in initiative. German armored formations, once dominant, now faced well-prepared Soviet defenses. The Red Army had accumulated experience, improved coordination, and expanded production. From this point onward, the strategic direction reversed. German forces increasingly fought defensive battles across vast front lines. Improvisation replaced planning. Units were redeployed constantly to plug gaps. The cost mounted relentlessly. By late 1943 and into 1944, German divisions were skeletal. Replacements were often young and inexperienced. Equipment shortages worsened. Air superiority shifted decisively to the Soviets in many sectors. Still, resistance continued. Cohesion, discipline, and fear sustained the army. For many soldiers, the war became less about conquest and more about survival and retreat. The environment compounded everything. Autumn rains once again created seas of mud, Rasputitsa, swallowing vehicles and artillery. Winter froze lubricants, jammed weapons, and immobilized machinery. Improvised winter clothing never fully solved the problem. Meanwhile, Soviet logistics improved steadily. Rail networks were repaired quickly behind advancing lines. Factories relocated east of the Urals earlier in the war now produced enormous quantities of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. German planners had underestimated the Soviet Union's capacity to absorb shock. What had appeared as weakness in 1941 was revealed as depth. Manpower reserves replenished shattered divisions. Industrial output compensated for catastrophic losses. The scale of the Soviet state proved decisive. By 1944, German forces in the East were fighting a defensive war along shrinking lines. The front that had once stretched triumphantly across Soviet territory now contracted toward the Reich itself. The initiative was gone. The question was no longer how far Germany could advance, but how long it could hold. By 1944, the German position on the Eastern Front had become increasingly precarious. What had begun as a war of rapid movement and ambitious conquest had transformed into a desperate struggle to hold ground. Soviet offensives rolled westward with growing strength, supported by massive artillery barrages, expanding air superiority, and an industrial base now fully mobilized. German divisions, often under strength and poorly supplied, fought to maintain lines that stretched hundreds of miles. The collapse accelerated in the summer of 1944. Operation Bagration, launched by the Red Army in June, crushed Army Group Center. Entire German formations were destroyed. The front disintegrated in sectors that had once seemed secure. The scale of loss was staggering. Veteran units vanished. Equipment was abandoned. Retreat became chaotic. The pattern repeated itself. Soviet forces penetrated weak points, encircled isolated formations, and advanced relentlessly. German commanders struggled to stabilize lines with dwindling reserves. By early 1945, the war had reached the borders of the Reich. The winter of 1944–45 was harsh, though not as catastrophic as that of 1941–42. Still, conditions were grim. Ammunition was scarce. Fuel shortages immobilized armored units. Vehicles were reserved strictly for emergencies. In some sectors, daily artillery allocations were limited to only a handful of shells per gun. Civilian laborers, often women or forced workers, were compelled to dig anti-tank trenches in frozen ground. Defensive positions were improvised with inadequate tools and exhausted manpower. Hitler continued issuing orders to hold every position. He made occasional visits to front areas, but these were carefully managed appearances. In reality, the situation was deteriorating beyond recovery. On the Vistula front, German forces attempted to hold a line along the Oder River, the last major barrier before Berlin. Key cities such as Stettin and Kustrin became focal points of resistance, but supplies dwindled further. Rations were cut. Drinking water shortages caused disease to spread. Dysentery weakened already malnourished troops. Many units now consisted of inexperienced recruits, some so young that tobacco in their rations was replaced with candy. Alongside them stood veterans who had fought since 1941, hardened but exhausted. Despite material weakness, resistance remained stubborn in places. Young and old fought side by side, attempting to slow the inevitable. Between the Oder and Berlin, a heterogeneous force gathered: regular Wehrmacht soldiers, Waffen-SS units, Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth members, and Luftwaffe ground personnel pressed into infantry roles. Improvised defenses faced overwhelming Soviet superiority in artillery and aircraft. On April 16, 1945, the final Soviet offensive toward Berlin began. Within days, German defensive positions were shattered. The Red Army advanced methodically, pushing toward the capital. Street fighting erupted in Berlin itself. The city became the final battlefield in the East. In May 1945, the guns fell silent. The war in Europe ended. Of the German soldiers who had marched east in June 1941, vast numbers were dead, wounded, missing, or prisoners. The cost ran into the millions. The ambition to conquer territory as far as the Volga had collapsed entirely. Instead of expanding eastward, Germany had seen the Soviet Union extend its influence westward. The political map of Europe was redrawn. Moscow emerged as a superpower. The Soviet system that Hitler had sought to destroy now determined the fate of much of Eastern and Central Europe. Memory took different forms in different lands. In Germany, veterans associations compiled lists of missing soldiers, hundreds of thousands whose fate remained unknown. Families clung to hope that loved ones might still return from captivity. In the Soviet Union, traces of the German presence were deliberately erased. Cemeteries were destroyed, crosses removed, graves leveled, fields were plowed over. Nature reclaimed the land. Monuments, however, rose where the Red Army advanced. Granite figures of Soviet soldiers gazed westward from pedestals, accompanied by artillery pieces or tanks, commemorating sacrifice and victory. History was preserved through these memorials. But beneath the soil of the steppe and forests lay the remains of countless soldiers, often without markers, without names. The Eastern Front had reshaped Europe irreversibly. It had consumed armies, altered borders, and left scars in memory that could not be erased. For those who survived, one certainty remained. What they had witnessed would never truly fade. The war had ended. Its consequences endured. To understand the Eastern Front solely through maps and military movements would be misleading. For the men who fought there, the war was not a series of arrows advancing or retreating across paper. It was a daily confrontation with cold, hunger, exhaustion, and fear. It was long nights in frozen trenches. It was endless marches across mud-choked roads. It was the silence after artillery ceased, and the dread of when it would begin again. The environment shaped everything. The Soviet Union's sheer scale overwhelmed invaders. Its geography swallowed formations. Forests concealed defenders. Swamps immobilized vehicles. Rivers without proper infrastructure complicated logistics. Vast open steppes offered little cover from artillery or aircraft, and the climate was merciless. Summer brought dust storms that choked engines and lungs alike. Torrential autumn rains turned entire fronts into seas of mud, the infamous Rasputitsa. Winter froze weapons, immobilized tanks, and reduced human endurance to its limit. In the winter of 1941–42, one of the harshest in modern Russian history, German soldiers found themselves catastrophically unprepared. Warm clothing was scarce, lubricants failed in extreme cold, rifles jammed, boots froze solid overnight. Veterans later summarized survival bluntly. Those who adapted lived, those who could not perished. It was a regression to primitive endurance. Soldiers focused on the simplest objective: survive one more day. Solidarity within small units became essential. Comradeship replaced ideology as the immediate source of strength. Sharing a blanket, a crust of bread, or a cigarette could mean the difference between resilience and collapse. The High Command had planned for rapid advance, not entrenchment. When winter arrived, forward units had no proper shelters. They dug shallow foxholes into frozen ground, insufficient against the cold. Fatigue accumulated relentlessly. There were no large-scale rotations to relieve frontline units. The front was too long, reserves too thin. Minor wounds that would heal in summer lingered for weeks in winter. Frostbite spread. Respiratory illnesses multiplied. Company strengths dwindled. Replacements arrived late and often lacked experience. The attrition gap widened. Meanwhile, the Red Army improved. Soviet equipment proved more resilient to cold. Uniforms were designed for winter warfare. Logistics adapted to terrain and climate. Lessons from earlier disasters were incorporated into planning. By contrast, German command structures struggled to reconcile ideology with operational necessity. The Eastern Front also evolved into an international battlefield. The Wehrmacht did not fight alone. Alongside German units stood contingents from Romania, Hungary, Finland, Italy, Slovakia, Croatia, and others. In total, Hundreds of thousands of non-German soldiers fought in the Soviet Union, some due to alliance obligations, others drawn by ideological motivations or anti-communist fervor. Yet these Allied armies often lacked adequate training and equipment. When assigned to hold vulnerable sectors, as at Stalingrad, they proved unable to withstand concentrated Soviet attacks. Their losses were severe. In later years, bitterness emerged among these allies. Some felt abandoned by German command during crises. Mutual distrust deepened. The Eastern Front became not only a clash between Germany and the Soviet Union, but a convergence of multiple European forces. It also became a theater where ideological narratives collided. For some volunteers, the war was framed as a crusade against Bolshevism. Propaganda emphasized defense of Western civilization. Others joined out of opportunism, nationalism, or coercion. Yet regardless of origin, once on the front, experience unified them in hardship. Across both sides, certain parallels emerged. German soldiers feared the Red Army. Soviet soldiers feared German reprisals. Both were shaped by authoritarian systems that demanded obedience and sacrifice. Desertion was rare, not solely because of conviction, but because alternatives were perilous. Capture did not guarantee safety. Prisoner of war camps on both sides were often harsh, under-resourced, and deadly. Soldiers found themselves trapped between two totalitarian regimes, each intolerant of dissent. As the war dragged on, awareness shifted. Early confidence gave way to grim realism. Soldiers recognized that victory was no longer assured. They also understood that retreat meant fighting across lands closer to their own homes. In Germany, as Soviet forces advanced westward, fear intensified. The idea that families and cities might fall under Soviet occupation strengthened resolve among many units. The Eastern Front did not collapse easily because it was sustained by layers of motivation, discipline, fear, comradeship, ideological belief, and the absence of viable alternatives. It was a war of extremes, and it reshaped every individual who endured it. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Eastern Front left behind more than ruined cities and altered borders. It left behind silence. For nearly 4 years, the largest land conflict in human history had raged across forests, steppes, rivers, and cities. Tens of millions had been killed, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire regions were devastated, villages vanished, generations were marked. Yet once the guns fell silent, much of what had happened remained buried, literally and figuratively. In Soviet territory, the traces of the German army were systematically erased. Cemeteries were destroyed, crosses torn down, markers removed. The land was leveled, plowed, replanted. Over time, grass and grain replaced trenches and shell holes. Nature reclaimed the battlefield. Beneath the soil lay countless remains of a defeated army, many unnamed, unmarked, and unmourned in the places where they fell. In contrast, wherever the Red Army advanced, monuments were erected. Granite soldiers stood on pedestals, gazing westward. Tanks and artillery pieces were displayed as symbols of victory. Eternal flames burned in city squares. Uniformed guards marched in ceremonial precision before memorials. The memory of sacrifice was curated and preserved. In Germany, memory took another form. Lists of missing soldiers were published by veterans' organizations. Families searched for news decades after the war ended. Hope lingered in some households that sons or fathers might still return from captivity behind the Iron Curtain. Official statements insisted that no prisoners remained. Many believed otherwise. The scale of loss deeply troubled those who had survived. It was not only the millions dead, but the absence of future generations, the sons who would never become fathers, the leaders who would never emerge. A chaplain who had served alongside German troops early in the war wrote bitterly after burying more parishioners on Soviet soil. The names of the fallen now outnumber those of the living in my notebook. My community is bleeding out on these plains. His words captured something essential about the Eastern Front. It was not merely a campaign of armies. It was a grinding consumption of youth and possibility. The initial ambition, to conquer territories as far as the Volga, had collapsed entirely. Instead of expanding eastward, Germany witnessed the Soviet Union's power extend westward. The political map of Europe was transformed. Borders shifted. Governments changed. A new global balance emerged. The Soviet system that had once seemed vulnerable in 1941 became the dominant force across half the continent. The German Reich, that had appeared unstoppable at the height of its expansion, lay in ruins. In retrospect, the Eastern Front was not decided by a single battle. Not Moscow, not Stalingrad, not Kursk. It was determined by a process of attrition, a process in which initial speed collided with vast geography, a process in which industrial capacity, manpower reserves, climate, and endurance outweighed early tactical brilliance. It was a war of scale beyond anything previously experienced in Europe. For individual soldiers, however, that scale was invisible. They rarely understood grand strategy. Most saw only their sector of the front, their immediate objective, their unit. A corporal wrote in early 1943 that he could barely see beyond his own section of the line and had no idea what was planned elsewhere. This limited perspective did not make them apolitical. Many fought with conviction, believing in propaganda narratives or in defense of homeland. Others fought because refusal was unthinkable. But regardless of ideology, daily existence was shaped more by mud, cold, orders, and comradeship than by abstract political theory. Combat did not occur constantly. Long periods of waiting, digging, transporting, and enduring defined much of life. Then suddenly violence erupted, intense, chaotic, decisive. In those moments, individual actions mattered profoundly. Outside of battle, responsibility was more ambiguous. War crimes were often committed far from the immediate front, in rear areas, under conditions where military engagement had ceased, but occupation and repression continued. On the front itself, soldiers faced symmetrical danger, armed enemy confronting armed enemy. But beyond it, violence could take darker forms. In the end, both sides developed extraordinary capacity for suffering. Both endured authoritarian systems that imposed heavy expectations. Both believed, at different times, that survival of homeland depended on total commitment. And when the war ended, those who survived carried its memory permanently. For many, the Eastern Front was not a chapter in a textbook. It was a frozen trench, a burning city, a comrade lost, a march through mud, a winter without end. The cannons are silent now. The forests have grown back. The steppe is green again. But beneath that quiet landscape lies the legacy of a war that reshaped Europe and consumed millions. And for those who lived through it, it never truly ended.